Good afternoon. Wow, that was a quick quiet. Welcome all to today's Schemmel Luncheon Seminar, another opportunity to learn together, to hear about and discuss matters that open our minds to ideas and issues that we may not have thought about before. Our own Len Gougeon, Distinguished Professor of American Literature at the university, an internationally renowned scholar of Ralph Waldo Emerson, will speak today on Transcendentalism, politics, and the Civil War. Too often we don't connect philosophy with action, ideas, and issues. But the fact is that the founding of our America was, in prosaic terms, an idea whose time has come. Our founders were a scholarly bunch who took the modern philosophies of their time seriously in shaping a nation whose government was to be, as Lincoln pronounced later, of, for, and by the people. Benjamin Franklin, as early as 1743, created the American Philosophical Society, whose motto was, "In pursuit of useful knowledge." Knowledge, in short, was the foundation on which we envisioned and shaped this nation. Dr. Gougeon will make the case that New England Transcendentalism was a major force in shaping the policies of the Lincoln administration regarding racial equality that changed American democracy forever. In these politically tumultuous times, it's important for us to learn more about who we are and who we aspire to be as a nation. To remember that words count, ideas count, and ideals and values count. So please welcome Dr. Gougeon to the podium.
Thank you, Sandra, for that generous introduction. I'll try to live up to the billing. The purpose of my presentation today is to show how an abstract philosophy like Transcendentalism had a very real impact on the politics of the Civil War, and to suggest further how important ideals are to the conduct of life in a civilized society. Lincoln's historic Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on the 1st of January, 1863. Just 12 days later, Samuel Sunset Cox, representative from Ohio, unleashed a bitter attack on New England Transcendentalists in an address to a large gathering of the Democratic Union Association held in New York City. The address was titled "Puritanism in Politics." It should be noted at this time, by the way, that the Democratic Party was the party of conservatism. It was the party of the slaveholders, and the Republican Party was the party of liberals and reformers. Things have obviously switched since that time, haven't they? At the time, Cox was the leading conservative Democrat in Congress. The focus of Cox's address was on slavery and the threat of racial equality, and New England's opposition to one and solid commitment to the other. As historian Mark Neely reports, this address, coming at this critical time, was the opening shot in a short-lived and ultimately unsuccessful effort by the Peace Democrats, or Copperheads as they were called, to manipulate sectional feeling within the North as a means toward partisan gain in the next election cycle. Their goal was to restore the Union as it was, slavery and all. Despite its importance to the political history of the war, Neely points out that, quote, "This brief assault on New England has never been satisfactorily explained by political historians." I'm going to explain it today. In his own relatively brief discussion of the speech, Neely never mentions the one element that Cox identified as the primary driving force behind New England's radical demand for racial equality and universal human rights at this time. It was not the Puritanism of the past, as might be inferred by Cox's title, but what he and other conservative Democrats understood to be its current and equally pernicious incarnation known as Transcendentalism. To understand the reason for Cox's attack on what appears today to be a rather abstract philosophy, which, according to one noted historian, promoted a, quote, cult of solitude and contemplation, requires a brief overview of the historical sources of this movement. New England Transcendentalism was the product of many influences. Three stand out in particular. The first is German idealism, based largely on the writings of Immanuel Kant and Johann Goethe. This was a major influence to the point that Emerson declared in his 1841 lecture on the subject that, quote, what is popularly called transcendentalism among us is idealism. He and his New England cohorts acquired their initial knowledge of Kant through an English Romantic writer, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge's Aids to Reflection blended Kantian philosophy with the ideas of various 17th century British Platonists. In these sources, transcendentalists found an affirmation of their belief in intuitively perceived abstract truth. That's what they took from Coleridge through Kant and Goethe, a belief in intuitively perceived abstract truths. New England Unitarians and Transcendentalists were predisposed to this belief through the second major influence on the movement, Puritanism. The early Puritan settlers of New England were high-minded idealists who were determined that their new civilization would be, quote, as a city upon a hill, a moral exemplum to the rest of the world. The third influence on American transcendentalism, and the one that is most relevant to this discussion today, was Asian philosophy. Emerson developed a strong interest in Indian, Chinese, and Persian literature and thought in the 1840s. The Hindu sacred texts were a major influence. He was especially taken by the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. These works emphasize the oneness of life that derives from the universal human spirit, the source of all life and all truth. Emerson called this life force the Oversoul in an essay by that name. According to Emerson, the definition of the Oversoul is as follows: that great nature in which we rest, that unity within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. That's from his essay, The Oversoul. It is this idea of unity, universal unity, that informs his belief that all forms of being are united through one shared universal soul. Like Emerson, most transcendentalists were members of the Unitarian Church at some point. Unitarianism was a latent liberal offshoot of Congregationalism, which was itself an offshoot of early Puritanism. While Emerson left the Unitarian Church early, seeking a broader freedom than the pulpit allowed, many transcendentalists like Theodore Parker and William Henry Furness and Thomas Wentworth Higginson and others remained in the church as ministers of liberal congregations. As long as your congregation supported you in the Unitarian tradition, then you can continue to preach and conduct yourself in that ministry. And so they did. Virtually all transcendentalists were, sooner or later, anti-slavery. Southern critics saw them in exactly this light. As J. Hubble points out, quote, Unitarianism, Universalism, and Transcendentalism were in the Southern view usually bound up with abolition and all other New England isms which seemed to threaten Southern society. An early article in the Southern Quarterly Review commented on The Dial, the transcendental journal that was edited by Emerson at this time. Emerson edited The Dial for the first 2 years of its existence, and Margaret Fuller, the foremost feminist of her time, edited for the following 2 years. The writer noted that this, quote, organ of the Transcendental Party in New England was a work of great interest and ability, but also eccentric and startling. The transcendentalists, he observed, are the enemies of antiquity and hostile to existing institutions and prevailing systems. They seek change and reform in all things. which was absolutely true. Emerson said in his essay Circles that his goal was to, quote, unsettle all things, right? Progress depends on movement. Collectively, the Transcendentalists had a significant effect on American politics and culture, both of which, as Samuel Cox and other conservative Democrats and Copperheads believe, were dominated by New England at the midpoint in the Civil War. Ultimately, Transcendentalism helped to shape the liberal democratic ideology that eventually informed the Union cause. From the beginning, Transcendentalists saw a powerful example of idealism in the Declaration of Independence. That document states, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." For Transcendentalists, these were universal truths, intuitively perceived by all people, i.e., they're self-evident. They do not need to be taught, only acknowledged. They reflect an innate sense of justice and truth that resides in all of us. Most conservatives of Emerson's day considered the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence to be mere, as one of them called it, glittering generalities that were never intended to be taken literally or even seriously for that matter. And so for the first 47 years of the nation's existence, this mental reservation was generally accepted. As a result, the heinous institution of slavery was allowed to flourish. Several recent studies have shown that Emerson and other prominent Transcendentalists were very active in the politics of reform, especially anti-slavery, and that vigorous social and political engagement was the natural result of Transcendentalism's emphasis upon idealism and social justice. The influence of Transcendentalism on the culture and politics of New England helped make the region a prime mover in the crusade for emancipation. The Abolition Movement begins in Massachusetts. Emerson had been active in the anti-slavery movement since the mid-1840s. Like other Transcendentalists, he was convinced that Negroes share in the same dignity that gave meaning and dignity, in the same divinity that gave meaning and dignity to all human life, and therefore they were entitled to the rights that are guaranteed to all citizens. Democracy and freedom, he recorded in his journal, have their roots in the sacred truth that every man hath in him the divine reason. That is the equality and the only equality of all men. And because every man has within him something really divine, therefore slavery is the unpardonable outrage it is. Given this belief, it is not surprising that political and social activism was a leading characteristic of Transcendentalism from the beginning, as shown in one of the earliest studies of the movement titled An Essay on Transcendentalism, written in 1842 by Charles Mayo Ellis. This work emphasizes the revolutionary character of the movement. Ellis appropriates the language of the Declaration of Independence in describing the Transcendentalist social and political goals. An ideal government, Ellis insisted, is one formed on, quote, natural, inherent, and inalienable rights, and the assertion of our freedom and equality. Belief in the unity of mankind meant freedom, dignity, and equal opportunity for all people. The consequence of this belief was that it made Transcendentalists the natural enemies of slavery. As a result, Albert von Frank notes, quote, not a single individual identifiable as a Transcendentalist, but was an active, vociferous supporter of the anti-slavery cause. This commitment grew deeper as America drifted toward civil war. Following John Brown's raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in October of 1859, Emerson, Thoreau, and Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May Alcott, were among the few who were willing to speak in his defense. At a public meeting held in Concord on the 30th of October, 1859, Thoreau delivered his plea for Captain John Brown. In his address, Thoreau praised Brown and described him as both a man of action and a, quote, transcendentalist. by which he meant, quote, a man of ideas and principles. Emerson's deep admiration for Brown undoubtedly derived from the fact that he also saw him as a man of principle and action. John Brown was an idealist, Emerson asserted, which for him, as for Thoreau, was the equivalent of a transcendentalist. When the Civil War broke out in April of 1861 with the firing on Fort Sumter, Emerson and his transcendental cohorts welcomed it. From the outset, they promoted an idealistic agenda of radical reforms designed to push the Lincoln administration and the North toward a morally inspired view of universal human rights. Transcendental abolitionists like Emerson, Samuel Joseph May, and Thomas Wentworth Higginson saw universal freedom, regardless of race, to be a God-given right. They were among the first to demand that emancipation be declared a Union goal. They had no interest in the reestablishment of a morally flawed union with slaveholders. It should be noted here that at the outset of the war, the goal of the Lincoln administration was to restore the Union as it was, with slavery limited to the slave states. Emancipation, abolition were not the goals envisioned by Lincoln at the time. Emerson's liberal coterie frequently published their views in the pages of the Atlantic Monthly and the North American Review after Charles Eliot Norton and James Russell Lowell took over the editorship of the latter in 1864. These were the two most highly regarded journals of thought in the country. The North American, the nation's oldest journal, was established in Boston in 1815. The Atlantic Monthly made its debut as the voice of liberal New England in 1857, and it still exists in the magazine called only now The Atlantic. The writers who were its core contributors from the outset constituted a veritable who's who of New England literati. Included were Emerson, John Greenleaf Whittier, James Russell Lowell, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, John Lothrop Motley, and others. This was the creme de la creme. These were the best writers in America and universally recognized to be so. The magazine was devoted by its own definition to, quote, literature, art, and politics, but as one historian has noted, no one could believe the founders' promise that it would be, quote, the organ of no party or clique. These men, he said, were all passionate abolitionists. Not surprisingly, as with the Dial earlier, Southerners took note of this new threat to the Southern way of life, that is to say, a threat to Southern slavery. Following the publication of just the second issue of The Atlantic, the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger noted that, quote, a dangerous enemy to the South has arisen in The Atlantic Monthly, the new literary organ of the Bostonians. This magazine, the author noted, offers articles of the highest excellence by the finest authors who are all enlisted in making attractive a work, the object of which is to wage war upon Southern society. When the Civil War broke out, the Atlantic's editor, James T. Fields, quickly weaponized this influential journal. In an act of patriotism, he replaced the image of Massachusetts Bay Colony's Puritan founding father, John Winthrop, which had appeared on the title page of every issue, with the American flag, demonstrating symbolically the journal's appropriation of the spirit of Puritanism to this new national crusade. Much of the writing that followed concerned the war and promoted a decidedly liberal agenda, especially emancipation and eventually racial equality. Not surprisingly, as the magazine's biographer reports, throughout this time, Southerners were depicted in Atlantic fiction as, quote, quintessentially the anathema of all high-minded New Englanders. I was tempted to say, and they still are, but I won't. While the New Englanders relied on the considerable publishing resources of Boston, another prominent transcendentalist, George William Curtis, was able to reach a large and popular audience through the New York press. Curtis was an Emersonian idealist who, as a young man, lived for a time at Brook Farm, the transcendental utopian community established by Emerson's cousin, George Ripley, in the 1840s. Following this, Curtis resided for a time in Concord so that he could be closer to his idols, Emerson and Thoreau. One of the things that he did while he was there was to help Henry David Thoreau build his cabin at Walden Pond. As an accomplished writer, editor, and lecturer, Curtis used his editor's easy chair column in Harper's New Monthly magazine to promote political views that reflected transcendental idealism. Also, after years writing a regular column called The Lounger for Harper's Illustrated Weekly, he became that journal's political editor in December of 1863. In that position, he told a friend he was able to turn the popular paper, with its circulation of over 120,000, from a, quote, semi-secession journal into an anti-slavery and Republican one. Early on in the war, Curtis articulated one of the Transcendentalists' major themes in a Harper's Illustrated Weekly essay titled Truth versus Twaddle. In this editorial, he attacked the racism of Samuel Cox and his Copperhead cohorts and argued that the Declaration's assertion of equality was intended to apply to everyone. Fundamental belief of all transcendentalists. The fathers said what they meant and meant what they said, he asserted. They meant all men. Curtis was unequivocal in his belief that American democracy draws no lines of distinction based on color. The yellow Chinese and the olive Spaniard or West Indian, or the red Turk or Hindu, or the white Englishman or Irishman, or the African Creole of any race may be a citizen of the United States. And with citizenship comes all the rights thereunto pertaining. And thus, quote, the ballot of the voter of tawny Spanish descent in New Orleans or of dusky African descent in Boston counts just as much in this government as the vote of the Honorable Mr. Samuel Cox of Ohio. Such a sweeping assertion of universal rights, including voting rights, must have been a bit breathtaking to a sizable segment of the weekly's estimated million-plus readers. Again, this was in June of 1862, well before the Emancipation Proclamation or even the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln was both aware and appreciative of the support his administration frequently received from these transcendental idealists in the pages of the Atlantic and Harper's. Like so many others at mid-century, he was also touched by the intellectual currents of transcendentalism. Very few modern scholars had taken note of this influence. Gary Wills, however, is one who has. In his work, Lincoln at Gettysburg, Wills describes at length a distinct transcendental element in Lincoln's thinking, with the ultimate expression of that influence being his most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, which he would deliver on November 19th, 1863, 11 months after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. According to Wills, the address itself sets up a, quote, dialectic of the ideal with the real, where a nation conceived in liberty by its dedication to the Declaration's critical proposition of human equality must test that proposition's survivability in the real world of struggle. As noted earlier, this very struggle had been articulated by the Transcendentalists as early as the 1840s. Wills goes on to argue that Lincoln's, quote, dialectic of ideals struggling for their realization in history owes a great deal to the primary intellectual fashion of the period, Transcendentalism. In fact, Wills later describes Lincoln as a transcendentalist without the fuzziness. Wills traces this transcendental element in Lincoln from Emerson through George Bancroft and Theodore Parker. He also points out that Lincoln's law partner, William Billy Herndon, was, quote, a homespun idealist and the disciple of that most militant transcendentalist, Theodore Parker, whom Emerson called our Savonarola. Herndon was virtually a disciple of Parker. Albert von Frank notes that in the summer of 1854, Herndon and his law partner, Abraham Lincoln, were in fact engaged in a lengthy study of the slavery question, trying to see their way through the collapse of old parties and the rise of new ones. Herndon, who was a close reader of Parker's works, opened a personal correspondence with him where he declared, quote, "You are my ideal, strong, direct, energetic, charitable." Von Frank notes that he wrote again on the 11th of June, 1854, that, quote, "He was spreading the gospel of Parker's works and of Emerson's works to everyone he met," which would certainly include, of course, Lincoln, his law partner and friend. While it was celebrated by New England transcendentalists and abolitionists and other moral sympathizers, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation sparked an immediate storm of protest when it took effect on the 1st of January, 1863. Just 8 days later, the conservative Boston Statesman and Weekly Post argued in an article titled "The Illegality of Emancipation" that, excuse me, quote, "As Commander-in-Chief, the President has no right by the laws of war to proclaim the emancipation of the slaves in those sections not under the immediate control of the federal armies." The sheer magnitude of the measure's apparent intent, namely to change the fundamental social and cultural paradigm of the South, was another matter. Quote, "A paper declaration," the statesman argued, "cannot change relations that are fundamental without most terrible and bitter revolution." But just such a revolution was clearly now underway. It was being fostered and encouraged by New England's intellectual class, with Transcendentalists leading the way. On the political side, not surprisingly, the conservative reaction was also deeply racist, as indicated in pamphlets such as these. It is in this highly politicized historical and cultural context that Samuel Cox delivered his fiery attack on New England and its transcendental idealists at a spirited meeting of the Democratic Union Association held in New York City just 13 days after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. The New York group had been formed to promote the goals of Northern conservatism, and Samuel Cox came prepared. He had a national standing, and as noted earlier, at the beginning of the war, Cox had assumed leadership of the conservative Democratic opposition in Congress. This opposition became more intense as the war continued and the Lincoln administration's policies became increasingly liberal, especially in regard to slavery and emancipation. And his conservative colleagues realized that the possibility of returning to the status ante, which was the original goal of the war, going back to what America was before it started, with slavery where it was becoming increasingly remote. The proclamation threatened to change forever the American social, political, and cultural landscape. For Cox, as for many Southerners, the real purpose of the war, as envisioned by the liberals of New England, was now, at last, made manifest by the Emancipation Proclamation. He opposed it with a fury. In the process, according to one historian, Cox used exaggeration and distortion to check what he considered extreme action. This tactic was nowhere more evident than in his New York address. This volatile presentation attracted considerable public attention as well as sharp criticism. Cox's title, Puritanism in Politics, indicates, like so many other commentaries throughout the war, the fusion of culture and politics. In this speech, which was published in its entirety in several Democratic newspapers, both North and South, as well as in pamphlet form, Cox specifically blamed New England transcendentalists and their Puritan ancestors more than Lincoln and the radical Republicans in Congress for bringing this abomination about. Like Southern critics before the war, Cox argued that New England's liberal culture threatened the entire nation. He made it clear in his fiery address that the most formidable challenge to the nation's existence and the restoration of the Union as it was actually came more from New England than from the South. Cox castigated the liberals of New England and their Puritan ancestors for their fanatical idealism and for causing the war in the first place. They were now preventing a peaceful settlement through their demand for and support of radical measures like the Emancipation Proclamation. Cox began his speech declaiming that, quote, Puritanism is the reptile which has been boring into the dike, which is the Constitution. And this Civil War comes in like the devouring sea. Its rushing tide of devastation will not be stayed until the reptile is crushed and the dike rebuilt. Cox was especially angry at the New England intelligentsia for propagandizing in newspapers, periodicals, pulpits, and in lecture halls for a more liberal construct of democracy, one that called for universal freedom and equality. That this was part of a larger conservative liberal divide in the country at the time is reflected in the fact that Cox's indictment of the New Englanders closely resembled that made earlier by Southern critics. New England, he asserted, may be accounted smart in intellect, cunning in invention, and energetic in industry. She may boast of her libraries, schools, churches, and press, but such smartness may be unable to comprehend the machinery of a state. It may bring, nay, it has already brought, crash and confusion where better minds evolve beauty and harmony. This beauty and harmony, of course, included the moral blight of slavery, but what the heck. Cox's ire at the New England's cultural hegemony and its religious and social liberalism is understandable. Unitarians and Transcendentalists had been a potent force throughout the top tier of New England's intellectual class for decades. Like Southern critics earlier, Cox also drew a direct line of descent from the early Puritan settlers of New England to present-day Transcendentalists and liberal Unitarian reformers. These included Theodore Parker and Wendell Phillips, as well as Massachusetts Governor John Andrew and Senator Charles Sumner, all of whom he disparaged as, quote, the lesser spawn of Transcendentalism. Indeed, these self-righteous moralists, he declared, are the marplots of the Republic. Also, like the Southerners, Cox maintained that abolition is the cause of the strife that America was now caught up in, and abolition is the offspring of Puritanism. Until abolition arose, the Union was never seriously menaced, he thundered. The Constitution was never endangered. Puritanism introduced the moral elements involved in slavery into politics and thereby threw the church into the arena. These are the guys who've been doing that. Cox stressed throughout his lengthy address that the current batch of Transcendentalist reformers were the direct descendants of Puritan moralists who imposed their iron will on the early settlers of New England. Quote, applying the old doctrines of Puritanism to our established order, he asserted, they began on moral grounds to undermine the structure of our civil society. For Cox, morality should never mix with polity. You might say, like a 19th century Tina Turner, he questioned what's morality got to do with it. He also expressed the deep resentment felt by many Westerners regarding New England's cultural and, in his view, now political hegemony. The West, by the way, at this time was Ohio, right, and Wisconsin, etc. He cast the Brahmin intellectuals of Boston, these guys, as snobs and elitists, even though, ironically, their agenda was focused on emancipation and equality. Clearly, it was the New Englanders, he declaimed, who were primarily responsible for this disastrous proclamation through their unique dominance in education, in literature, in the arts, and now in politics. Even the president, it seems, had fallen under their spell. It is always understood, Cox said, that what is for the common defense and public welfare is to be decided by the Brahmins of Boston. It being also further understood that we suitors of the West, being of another and inferior caste, are obliged to confess the infallibility of the Brahminal decision. It is under just such doctrines that proclamations of anti-slavery issue. Other sections are not to be consulted. Had the central, western, and border states been consulted, the proclamation never would have been issued, and by their help, it never can or shall be executed. Giving to the rebellion more vigor and unity, and to the North discouragement and division, it will only be potent for mischief by rendering the war a failure and the Union hopeless. This is the direful result of these intermeddling purists of New England. Cox what do you really got against them? I mean, Cox then went on to identify more specifically the intellectual and moral ideology that was working such mischief in the nation. Quote, it comes from that coterie known around Boston as Transcendentalist, he declared. Its most clever exponent is Emerson. It has its priests, high and low, including the great William Ellery Channing, who ministered in holy things with many enlarged graces of heart. Cox then asked rhetorically, but what is this transcendentalism? In answering, he chose to emphasize the Asian element and its emphasis on a unifying world soul, similar to Emerson's idea of the oversoul. As noted earlier, it was this element and transcendentalism, more than any other, that informed the ideal of universal human equality, which in turn lent moral support to measures like the Emancipation Proclamation. According to Cox, this pernicious spiritual concept was common to both systems. Quote, all the poetic prose and prosaic poetry of Emerson, all the infidelity of Parker, all the sentimentalism of Wendell Phillips, Cox observed, comes from the dialogues of Krishna and Arjuna called the Bhagavad Gita. This philosophy cannot be called pantheism, he noted, for that absorbs God and man for that absorbs nature and man in God. It is not materialism, for that absorbs man and God in nature. But it is the absorption of God and nature in man, and that man, the Brahmin of the Puritan, believes in nothing but the soul. The soul of man is God and nature. No matter, no color, nothing but the soul in man. He is all. It is all. For Cox, this toxic mix of 17th century Puritanism and ancient Hindu philosophy was the essence of the 19th century reefer madness known as Transcendentalism. You can Google reefer madness, by the way. According to Cox, it was this perverse belief in a universal colorless soul and transcendental oneness that led these dreamers to embrace the bizarre and noxious notion of racial equality. He pointed out that, quote, one of these disciples, Alcott, holds that the world would be what it should be if we were only as holy as he. Another, Emerson, holds that he, Emerson, is God, that God is everything. Therefore, he, Emerson, is everything. Do you wonder, therefore, that since he makes the Negro a part of himself, that he holds him to be his equal? Extraordinary. Do you wonder at the imperturbable impudence and self-sufficiency of the Puritan thus indoctrinated? The Hindu said, rich is that universal self, whom thou worshipest as the soul. The same sentiment, Cox says, is found in the verse of Emerson. It was just such idealistic, moonshiny delusions as these, Cox believed, that led directly to such disruptive and divisive foolishness as the recent Emancipation Proclamation and the radical push for equal rights. It also brought swords into the street and shattered the peace of a once harmonious and prosperous society. The painted dream of universal emancipation, Cox declared, the offspring of this heathen philosophy, which has been pressed upon the ruling powers in Washington by Emerson and his cabal of egotistic zealots, would render reunion on the basis of the status ante, the goal of conservative Northern Democrats like Cox, impossible. After thus tracing, quote, the footprints in history of this inveterate foe to our democracy, as he called it, Cox assured his audience that this fanaticism will eventually give way, and order will be restored to the great republic. The dissonant din of these ideologists of New England will be drowned in the popular voice, he declared. The fratricidal hate they have engendered will be assuaged, and into the lacerated bosom of this nation will be poured the hallowed and healing spirit of mutual confidence and conciliation. Democracy will, if it take a lustrum to do it, fight under the old constellated banner, making its order of march an order of battle from now until 1864 for the restoration of the Union as it was by the supremacy of the Constitution as it is. Newspaper accounts of the speech noted that these final words were met with, quote, tremendous and continued applause, followed by shouts of lock them up, lock them up. No, I added that last part. Despite the efforts of Mr. Cox and his conservative followers, after the applause died down and the war went on, and their campaign to keep the past upon its throne eventually failed. As historian Neely indicates, the response to Cox's speech by Republicans throughout the North, especially in New England and among those of New England heritage, quote, proved important politically and much longer lived than the brief Democratic anti-New England sally itself. Although substantially unnoticed by political historians, the result was, quote, a conscious reassertion of New England identity that left the region's historical image perhaps as triumphant as it ever had been since the end of the 17th century. Indeed, Cox's address precipitated a, quote, cultural counterattack in the pages of the Atlantic Monthly and other places that contributed to what one historian refers to as, quote, Yankee triumphalism. The Emancipation Proclamation and later the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, ending slavery forever, the 14th Amendment in 1866, guaranteeing equal protection to all citizens, and the 15th Amendment in 1870, guaranteeing suffrage to all adult males, quote, without regard to race, color, or previous conditions of servitude, promised a new birth of freedom in America. The Transcendentalists of New England undoubtedly took some comfort in the fact that their persistent idealism and unflagging faith in universal truth helped to bring this revolution about. Thank you.
You identified Lincoln as influenced by the transcendentalism. How did they react when he decided to dump his vice president, who was a very established abolitionist, and take a notorious racist as his running mate? And then how did they campaign and react when that notorious racist, in fact, became the president?
I don't know. Well, yeah. As I tell my students in class, if I don't know the answer, I'll make something up, you know. What's that? Oh, how did the Transcendentalists who had an influence on Lincoln react when Lincoln, in running for re-election, dumped his vice president, who was an abolitionist, in favor of a racist to run for the second term? How did they react to that? That was the question.
Yeah, and how did they then behave and campaign when that vice president became the president?
Yeah, Andrew Johnson. With the election, I think that they believe that in America, politics is politics, and that Lincoln had proved very adept in maneuvering the minefield of politics during the Civil War period, because the forces that were at work were so antagonistic and complex. They wanted him to move, for example, to emancipation very early, but he understood that the nation has to be ready for it. And so his gradual movement toward it proved to be effective, and they appreciated and understood that when the time finally came. I don't know that they ever made a comment about his choice of Andrew Johnson for his new running mate, but I think at that point they believed he's in the driver's seat. It's really Lincoln rather than whoever he's taking with him, and that he took this guy from Tennessee because he needed or anticipated the need for additional political support. So that's fine. When Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson became president and started following his racist policy, they were appalled and resisted it tooth and nail. Emerson said, you know, we must all come together to put the brakes on what he called our mad president. So, you know, they shifted immediately away from it. At first they thought that Johnson was going to be another Lincoln in pursuing Lincoln's Reconstruction policies, but it was very clear very soon that he wasn't. And at that point, they became the opposition. Yeah. Any other questions? Additions, subtractions?
Can you just repeat the question?
Okay.
So, how did the Transcendentalists feel about immigration? Were they supportive of immigration?
Yeah, absolutely. They saw diversity as being the strength of America, a nation that was open to all. And as Curtis said in his Truth versus Twaddle, that these individuals, once they arrive, become Americans, right? Whether they're, tawny Spaniards or whether they're Creoles or whether they're Asians, whatever they are all Americans once they get here. So they had a very open notion, and which goes along with the idea of a universal human family. They had no reservations about immigration. They saw it, as I think enlightened people see it, as a source of strength. The diversity is a source of strength, not weakness. Yep. Emerson hated the Know Nothing Party, for example, and their protest form of nationalism.
I'm trying to understand the over-the-top rhetoric of Marx. Thank God we don't have anything like that today. But in trying to get a handle on it, I'm wondering, was he a slaveholder, or was it just his notion of what would make the world right?
Yeah, he was a graduate of Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And clearly he understood Transcendentalism. I mean, everything he said about Transcendentalism was accurate, and it really surprised me when I was reading it, that he wasn't, just bloviating shotgun fashion against something he didn't like. He actually understood what it was, and especially the Asian element. And he brought that knowledge, to his speech in order to indict what he didn't like. But as I noted, the divide in America was conservative versus liberal. And there were strong conservative sentiments in the North that mirrored the strong conservative sentiments of the South. And that these copperheads and conservative Democrats wanted to restore the Union, but with slavery in place. They were willing to accept slavery. That was their goal. And they didn't part with Lincoln until the Emancipation Proclamation, which made it very clear. They had some suspicions before that with the Union Army accepting contraband, for example, and employing them and de facto freeing them. They became rather uncomfortable with that because it was a form of liberation. But when the Declaration of Independence was announced in September of 1862, it went into effect on January 1st, 1863, then that was the divide. They became then the disloyal opposition who were willing to do anything to defeat this march toward liberalism.
Is this a war that's going to continue to rise from time to time in this country?
It was William Faulkner who said, "The past is never dead. In fact, it's never passed," right? And I think we're seeing that. Yeah, when you look at the red states and the blue states, well, the red states were the Confederate states, and the blue states. Yeah, we're talking about immigration, we're talking about American identity, we're talking about reserving privilege for the elites while exploiting everybody else. I mean, it's the same phenomenon. It doesn't really. The polarities never change. The terms change, but the polarities never change. Emerson said this divide between conservative and liberal, he thought was indicative of human nature itself. When he looked at history, he said every society that has ever evolved a structure has, liberals on one side and conservatives on the other, however you want to divide it. I think he's right about that. I think it is the divide of human nature. Yes? It didn't. No. Well, the Southern Society was very hostile to liberal ideas of all sorts. And so when Unitarianism and Transcendentalism became identified with anti-slavery, basically by the mid-1830s, as the Abolition Movement was beginning to take shape in Massachusetts, the South became a closed society. I mean, they literally did not allow newspapers or journals or lectures or preachers to raise the issue of slavery or abolition. They didn't want to hear it, and it became a walled-off community. This had the effect of pushing the New Englanders to more overt forms of resistance to slavery, especially following the annexation of Texas in 1845, which added considerably to the slave territory and the influence of slavery. They had previously believed that moral suasion, appealing to the better angels of our nature, would eventually call forth a moral response in the South that would allow them to see the evil of the institution that was central to their culture. But once the society was completely blocked off and it wasn't possible to communicate, then it eliminated the possibility of moral suasion. And so what does that leave? It leaves militant transcendentalism, taking a stand and resisting the incursions of slave power into the North. Richard.
In the flow of these last few questions, the intensity of now versus then, and particularly with attention to willful ignorance, which depended more on willful ignorance.
Your question, Richard?
The intensity of the feelings now,
Yes.
as compared to antebellum and through the Civil War, to some extent, there's a lot of difference in opinion, some of it bolstered only by willful ignorance. Is there a comparison of this time to that?
Willful ignorance. Clearly, the polarization. I mean, the country right now is not since the Civil War, I think, have we seen the nation so polarized. Whether it's willful ignorance or a commitment to an agenda that is, in the eyes of the other side, pernicious, I don't know. But clearly, the polarization is acute right now. Yeah. Joe.
Yes. Thank you very much. It seems like the lesson to take away is the power of ideas
Yes.
in terms of how they influence politics, daily life. It seems like the conservative right realized that a few decades ago, or not that long ago, and pushed their ideological framework from individual scholars to think tanks. And it seems like the liberal left, we'll call them, hasn't done that. I don't know when they ever did it, but there's no battle of a consistent ideological framework to go against the libertarian position of the right. I'm not sure if I'm asking a question. Why is the left so
Incoherent?
yeah. Yes, empty of that respect for the power of ideas, not just transactional views or positions or.
Yeah. That's a good question, and frankly, it seems to me that with the polarization of politics in America, it would behoove the liberal side to identify clearly the values that inform their cause and to stick with those values, reiterating those values, bringing home those values, emphasizing those values over and over and over again. Because with the diversity that characterizes a liberal movement, and that's one of the things that makes it difficult. I mean, they're not herding the entire membership the way conservatives do. They're very good at lockstep. They're very good at following the talking points. They're very good at staying in line. They're disciplined. That's what Cox called the machinery of government. The machinery of government. He said the conservatives can do that. The liberals can't. And that their fanatical ideas about freedom precipitate chaos and conflict, right? So that's always a problem that liberals have because there are so many voices. But I think those voices all have something in common. And part of it is what's in the Declaration of Independence. Why not go back to that? Why not start with that when it comes time to resist voter suppression that's aimed at particular groups, that's aimed at particular races, and identifying, the enemies of America are at our borders because they look a little bit different from you and your neighbor, but the enemies of our country are actually the people that made this country great and will continue to make it great because of the infusion of life and vitality and energy that diversity always brings, right? And liberals know that, but that very diversity and that very freedom and that very spontaneous energy that they bring is somewhat chaotic, right? And that's its nature to be chaotic. As Emerson said, I want to unsettle all things. All right. They're all unsettled. Now what? And so we're going to have to do something now. I have a lecture that I usually end my courses with here at the university that quotes from St. Ignatius, that famous quotation, to his students, go forth, he said, and set the world on fire. And I used to say that to my students, but now I say, you don't have to do that anymore. It's on fire, right? Now it's up to you. To bring things back into some kind of humane order, to remind us of what we are when we are at our best, and remind us of the values that have given us strength, and remind us of the values that have brought us together, rather than the values that have divided us. That's what they've got to do, and it does puzzle me that they aren't more conscious of that. But maybe with things now lurching toward crisis stage, they'll reach down inside and find out what it is they're standing on, right? What is it that's going to inform your resistance to this imminent catastrophic collapse of everything we have believed in? There's the point. What is it we have believed in? Let's dredge those up, say them very clearly, stand on them, run for them, and demand that they get the respect that they have always deserved and that have made the country what it is or has been. Yeah. Right, let's go again. Are you with me? All right. Yeah.
I was thinking, listening all the New England thinkers, my mind was going to California and the love generation. They had idealism, like the Beatles did, all you need is love. They were anti-racist. They believed in radical social change, namely America as the continent of tomorrow. They were anti-war. And they had an academic enabler like Timothy Leary. Was there residual transcendentalism in the love generation?
Is there a what in trend?
Residual transcendentalism in the love generation.
Oh, yeah. You're looking at one of them. Yes, absolutely. The countercultural movement of the 60s, I think, was an iteration of the same movement towards idealism that characterized the transcendental movement, which led, in the 60s you had communes, being formed. They were quite common, but they were also in the 1840s, like Brook Farm, and like Skaneateles and Oneida, and there were lots of communities formed in order to bring to life a value system that stood outside of the cultural norm of getting and spending, right? The town that I grew up in Massachusetts, Northampton, had one called the Northampton Association for Education and Industry. And Sojourner Truth was a member of that organization. And there were other members of it who contributed substantially to the movement towards reform in 19th century America. Actually, Henry Steele Commager, the historian, refers to that period, 1830 to 1860, as the era of reform, because there were so many reform movements of so many different types. And he said Emerson was the cow from which they all got their milk. Right? Right. Sandra.
In our lifetime, in our recent lifetime, that we have had people who you describe as chaotic, where I think what's going on now is chaos.
Mm-hmm.
That had the values and ideals of the nation. You know, the Obama administration, the FDR, other democratic administrations have certainly not been chaotic, and I think that they were true to the idea of improving, making a more perfect human.
Yes. The observation was that there have been liberal movements in the past, FDR, the Obama administration, I would add Martin Luther King Jr., who were able to coalesce energies and move them in a direction that had a significant impact upon the society and improving it. But I think those are the instances that I was just telling Joe. I mean, that's when they reached down and they found the values that gave centrality and meaning and purpose to their cause. And by returning to those repeatedly, we're able to move the movement.
On the road to that more.
Yeah. Yeah, it is possible, but again, all that it requires, I mean, it seems simple, is to go back to your roots, go back to what you essentially believe in, right? Now, spit it out. Spit out the butt ends of your days and ways. What do you stand for? What do you represent? What is it that you live for? What is it that gives meaning to your life? What belief do you hold that you hold so strongly that you die before you gave it up? And if there isn't anything that you would die for, then what are you living for? Ro.
Okay, in Emerson's oversoul,
Yes.
God, man, nature.
Mm-hmm.
Where does women fit?
What's that?
Where do women fit?
When in the 19th century, the common meaning of the word man was mankind, humankind. That's what he meant.
But all of those people that you have there are men.
Yes.
Those people who slaughter, right?
Yes.
Where were the women?
There were women that were involved in the reform movement. There were women who were transcendentalists. There were influential women like Margaret Fuller, like Elizabeth Peabody and Sophia Peabody, like Lydia Marie Child, editors of anti-slavery newspapers, writers of anti-slavery books, and movers in the society. But the fact of the matter is that the society overall was structured to authorize male dominance. The notion of separate spheres was dominant in the 18th century, and even earlier than that. The notion was that women were born to be mothers and wives. And their sphere was the domestic sphere. That's where they lived, that's where their work was, and that's where their lives were spent. The men operated in the public sphere, right? They became the lawmakers, the lawyers, the teachers, the corporate heads, et cetera, because nature has equipped them for that. That was the notion that was dominant at the time. Margaret Fuller was so smart that she used to tutor young men in German. She translated Goethe's work, for example. She made a great contribution to the evolution of Transcendentalism, but she couldn't go to Harvard. She's tutoring the young men who are going there, but she can't go there herself because women were not provided with opportunities for higher education. It was considered improper. She wrote a magnificent study called Woman in the 19th Century, where she lays it all out, that she wants every barrier thrown down. She wants every opportunity that's open to men to be open to women. She wanted equality, she said. When they talk about the unity of marriage, that's what you should be interested in. She said you have to be a unit before you're going to have unity. Right? You have to be yourself before you can become part of anything everything else, right? And that's very, that's the essence of Transcendentalism. It's self-reliance. You have to know who you are, what your values are, what gives meaning and dignity and purpose to your life. And then, once you've plumbed those resources, you can join a cause and contribute to it without being consumed by it or disappearing in it, because you know who you are. You have to be a unit before you can have unity. I like that idea she had. But again, women throughout the 19th century suffered enormous prejudice against them entering the public sphere.
So what is the current role of Transcendentalism, particularly in terms of civil rights, gay rights, and, as Mortimer said, women's rights?
Anybody who reads Emerson will be inspired to pursue the very things that you mentioned. Martin Luther King Jr. was an avid reader of Emerson and Thoreau, for example. Mahatma Gandhi was an avid reader of Emerson. As a matter of fact, I brought this in case there was a question, but I'll share it now. This is Gandhi, right? He's writing to his brother, and he's telling him, tell my nephew that I would advise him to read Emerson's essays. They can be had for 9 pence in Durban. There is a cheap reprint out. Those essays are worth studying. He should read them, mark the important passages, and then finally copy them out in a notebook. Yes. The essays, to my mind, contain the teaching of Indian wisdom in Western garb.
Doesn't he say to read Gougeon?
Yes, absolutely. But he didn't know that. Emerson has inspired lots of revolutionaries and continues to do so, I think. Just one point about that, Maury. The first president and one of the co-founders of the NAACP was an Emersonian. An Emerson. He used to quote Emerson in his speeches. He was Emerson's son's classmate at Harvard, Moorfield Story. He was president of the American Bar Association. He was founder of the Anti-Imperialism League, and then joined with W.E.B. Du Bois to establish the NAACP. He was the president of the NAACP for the first 20 years of its existence, 1909 to 1929. He was an Emersonian.
Well, thank you for this illuminating talk, and I hope it's been very energizing, and we all go and get our act together. Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you very much.